Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm Owen, and I'm your host. In this episode, I sit down with Dan Moren, who is a writer for Macworld, host of multiple well-known podcasts such as Clockwork, and author of the Galactic Cold War sci-fi book series. In this episode, we discuss everything from how he grew his podcasts to how he became head writer at Macworld. If any of this sounds interesting to you, remember to subscribe and leave a review so you never miss a podcast and so I can keep growing this podcast. Let's get in the episode. So, to start off, just start with who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name's Dan Moren. I am an author and a tech journalist and a podcaster. I'm the author of the Galactic Cold War series of sci-fi spy novels. I also do a number of podcasts, including some tech podcasts, Clockwise over at Relay FM, The Rebound, which is an independent tech podcast. And I'm a frequent podcaster over at The Incomparable, which is a big podcasting network full of pop culture shows, as well as a tech journalist at Six Colors and a columnist at Macworld. And somehow I still have no time after any of that.
Yeah, so you do juggle a lot of things. I want to start with podcasting. How did you get into the format of podcasting?
I think the first time I started to do podcasts was way back in 2006 or so. I was on a tech-centric blog called MacUser, which at the time was owned by Macworld. And I started out blogging there. And while Macworld had a podcast, MacUser didn't have its own podcast. So I sort of enlisted some of my fellow bloggers there to sort of start doing a show, which I would edit in GarageBand. And then I briefly sort of ended up doing some segments here and there on the Macworld podcast, which was pretty well established at that point. And then a friend and I actually launched a podcast, sort of a comedy podcast that the two of us did, which we did for 10 episodes or something before the real life got in the way. And yeah, that was kind of my first foray into it. I mean, podcasting was really new at that point because, I think really in the early 2000s when the iPod got really popular is when it kind of started. But I kind of started in at the very beginning, and I think that probably helped. And it's a lot harder nowadays, I think, in some ways, to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of podcasts out there. Mm-hmm. A lot of ones that are inactive as well.
True.
So you have a bunch of different podcasts. How did you get your foot in the door with all of these podcasts? And then you also have some as part of networks, like you said, Relay FM, and then the Incomparables. How has that been working with those podcast networks?
Well, it's been great. In both of those cases, I ended up being one of the very early people to start out with that. And it came about via people I knew. So The Incomparable, which started in 2010, is run by my friend Jason Snell, who was my boss at the time, actually. He was the editor-in-chief of Macworld. I worked for him, and we became friendly sort of outside that. And we had a bunch of other friends online who we have these email conversations. We're like, we should talk about these books that we like or movies that we like, and maybe podcasting would be a way to do that. So I was on the first Incomparable episode back in 2010, and I've been on a number of episodes since then. I mean, we're in the 600s or something like that. And then over time, we got more shows that sort of spun off from the main show because people would want to do different things. Like, we want to talk just about movies, or we want to talk about games, and we ended up having a number of various shows that sort of were more specialized. We started a D&D podcast very early on when that was sort of before that got really, really popular. We did some game shows and stuff like that. So my experience with that has always been great because all those people are people I know, they're friends, and as the network has grown and more hosts have come on, it's sort of just become this really great community. And then, our listeners, obviously, we've ended up with this very devoted listenership. And so having that and having a membership program more recently has ended up just enhancing the community. Relay FM story kind of similar. It was founded by a couple of folks that I know, Mike Hurley and Stephen Hackett. And they happened to be starting up the network right around the time that I ended up leaving Macworld. And one of the shows, Clockwise, which I do with my friend Jason Snell at the time, we basically had been doing that under the auspices of Macworld, but we were allowed to take the show with us when we both sort of went independent. And Jason was like, "Hey, I'm doing this other show with Mike and Steven on this network. What do you think about bringing Clockwise to the network as well?" I was like, "Oh, that's great. I love doing the show." So that was a really great experience in 2014, I think. And we've been on the network ever since. And it's been a fantastic way to sort of raise the profile of our show, as well as just have this, again, a great community that's been built up around all these shows and all the various not just the shows, but the other stuff they do. Like right now in September, as we record this, it's National Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, and they've done this huge campaign for St. Jude's for the last 4 or 5 years, I think. And it's cool to have be part of such a big community that can make an impact like that in addition to just producing, shows.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Yeah, I've followed a few of the shows and I've heard about that fundraiser, which is really good. That's really great that they can do that for a lot
Absolutely.
of people.
Yeah, it's impressive work that they've managed to do.
Yeah, definitely. Is joining like a podcast network something that's like, I don't know, beneficial for like newer podcasters? Like, is that something that you would recommend, or is that something that you think is better like as you progress and as you get to like build your following?
I think that both have advantages. As a podcaster that's just starting out, I think a network is a great way to raise the profile of your show, especially if there's like a lot of other shows on the network that are popular. It doesn't always work. Like, it's tough to cross promote stuff sometimes. People get very focused in on like, I love this show, but I don't want to, even on Relay FM, which is a great network full of awesome shows. I know there are some super popular shows, and it's hard sometimes to attract people from those audiences onto other shows. But I do think it, if nothing else, gives you a resource in terms of other creators that you can talk to and like learn from. That's been a huge asset for me in my work on networks, is basically having other people to turn to and being like, hey, this thing isn't working, or like, I don't know how to do this. How do you do this? Or how do you get these results that you get? So having like, peers that you can work with and sort of tap their brains and sort of figure out like how to learn more has always been a great experience. And I think, if you're coming to it from a more established point of view, I think it's a lot of times easier. I mean, the tough thing about getting into a network when you're sort of starting out is like you're an unknown quantity, and it's tough to get people to take a chance on you necessarily. But obviously, if you have a little bit more of a following, there's a great opportunity there for you to say like, oh, hey, I'm coming into this network, but I'm bringing something of my own that maybe you don't have already. And I think that's huge if you can do that. But it's certainly tough when you're just starting out to actually have a following of any kind.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. It's something that like helps build you up, but it's hard to get as like a smaller person, but
Sure.
It's easier to get when you're more established, but it doesn't like do as much necessarily.
Yeah, it can be harder to get a benefit out of that when you already sort of have your little audience, and like it's tough. I mean, finding an audience for any sort of creative work, I think, is very difficult in podcasts. As you said, there's a ton of them out there. So setting yourself apart from the crowd is definitely still a challenge in this day and age.
Yeah, definitely. So you're on a bunch of different podcasts. How many of them, like, did you start? How many of them did you start?
Let's see. Clockwise, I started with Jason when we were at Macworld. The Rebound, I started when I left Macworld. And then most of the incomparable shows that I do as like a host are shows that I started. And then I appear on a lot of shows as panelist too, where I'm just sort of like get to be a voice in the crowd, which is for me more relaxing because as not having any production responsibilities is always nice. I just get to sit here and talk to people. That's way easier than editing a show.
Yeah, right.
But yeah.
How did you get the ideas for those? It seems like there's quite a variety from tech to like pop culture and like the nerdy kind of stuff. How did you find those ideas?
Yeah, I think some of them, a lot of them grow out of things that I like to do. A lot of the shows that are more casual. Like I think of shows like The Rebound as a tech show, but it's like two friends who are also big into Apple as I am, and just having an opportunity to sort of chat and like have that particular voice that we have. It was very irreverent compared to a lot of the stuff I think that was on at the time. And so that was an idea for me, like the main driving force there was like, A, these are funny people I know that I know very well. We have a good rapport. And B, also being a show that was shorter. That show tends to run maybe 45 minutes. And I know there's a lot of tech shows that go on for like 2 hours. Sometimes it's like, I just don't have time to listen to those as someone who likes tech, but likes listening to podcasts. I don't have 2 hours to listen to a podcast. So the idea of something short appeals to me. And that was also one of the driving forces behind Clockwise when we created that. We wanted something that was very regimented, very not quite scripted, but like it had a format. And I thought that was an interesting idea. Again, in a world where podcasts often tend to be very freeform, to have something that mimicked maybe a little bit more of a TV show or radio show where it's like We have, a time limit. It's never more than 30 minutes. We have sort of a format of the way that the discussion progresses, and like everybody brings a topic, and so we have like 2 guests, 2 hosts, and we sort of go around, and everybody gets a chance to talk about the topics that were brought. And I just love the idea of a show that had like a kind of a harder format to it. It feels like something that doesn't get done as much in podcasting, and I feel like it really lends itself to the medium, and it's a great way to get more voices in and to get people to listen in a way that, like, again, if you don't have 2 hours, you can listen to a show that's 30 minutes. And then a lot of the pop culture stuff is just stuff I'm passionate about and interested in, and it's always fun. I would be talking about this stuff with people even not recording it as a podcast. So having that as an outlet is like, well, we might as well record it.
Yeah, exactly. Might as well get some extra benefit,
right,
in addition to the fun of talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any of your shows on YouTube, or are they all just audio only?
Most of them are audio only. The one show that we tend to do on YouTube is Total Party Kill, which is a D&D podcast that's at the Incomparable. And so we've been, I think we started later. I think we started out audio only and then eventually moved into doing YouTube streaming on that because, again, it was something that seemed to fit a little better into the medium. Like a lot of the podcasts we do, I think our audience is very audio-centric. And so having, video for them didn't always appeal, but there are definitely shows that we have done, including some more like game show stuff where I feel like that the video adds an extra dynamic to it. And with D&D, obviously, like, that's a pretty popular medium to use for that as well. So I think YouTube ended up being something that was made a lot of sense for that kind of podcast. But I think it really depends on the kind of show you got and the sort of, the way that you want to produce it. Like not everybody's always up to be on video. Like it's definitely more of a preparation. I gotta be on camera and I gotta sit right and I gotta smile and all that stuff. And it's definitely requires a whole extra part of your brain to manage all of that, as well as talking about stuff and getting really into it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. So you're really into like the long form podcasting and then also like writing books, and you were a writer at Macworld. So there's a lot of that long form content, which I don't know. I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about how it was I forget his name, but he has like a creator media company. Mm-hmm. It's like a consulting company. And he was talking about how like the difference between long form content and short form, and how long form is like much better for building a community. Have you ever thought about doing short form, or like just how that might affect like some of your podcasts if you like clip them?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you're right that the long form is better for building a community because people get to feel like they know you, and there's a certain degree of like really, bringing people in and having them become almost part of the experience and part of the sort of, not exactly the back and forth, but like, they sort of get drawn into the conversation. I think that's harder to do with a short podcast. I think there's a lot of stuff for short form that appeals because I think like both attention span wise and also just in general, like time wise, people often don't have a lot of time. And so being able to have something that you kind of digest in a small bit, I think has a lot of appeal to it. One of my podcast partners, Lex Friedman, does a show called Your Daily Lex, which is just him like for 5 minutes, and he like does a podcast every day. And it's like, 5 minutes, you got 5 minutes. You can listen to a podcast for 5 minutes. And I mean, there's definitely something accessible about that, which is really nice. But unless you're committed to doing it maybe every day, I guess maybe it's harder to draw an audience in if you're like, well, I got 5 minutes for you, but it's once a week or something, like people forget about it or don't look forward to it as much.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually haven't listened to that. I haven't seen too much of that kind of podcasting, like strictly on podcast platforms. I don't know if I'm just like not aware of it. Have you seen that?
No, not a lot of it. I don't think it's very common. I feel like a lot of podcasts tend to be much longer form. And like I said, an hour to 2 hours or something like that seems to be more common. I mean, a lot of that probably grows out of like TV and radio shows where you had like scheduling blocks and like everything's an hour long or half an hour long. And, that makes a little more sense than couldn't really run a TV show or a radio show that was 5 minutes very often. But yeah.
Right. I also feel like it's kind of hard to get like into a good conversation with someone. Yeah. If that's the format of your podcast.
I will say there are some There are some. I was just thinking the exception that proves the rule always. There's a radio show that does basically economic news marketplace, which is on a lot of NPR stations, and they have a couple podcasts that are sort of spun off but are also aired on the radio sometimes that are like 10 minutes. So they do like a tech version called Marketplace Tech, and oftentimes it's on the radio at like 6:50 in the morning, right? Like sometime right before 10 minutes before the hour. But you can also get it as a podcast. And I think it's a clever idea to have like spin-off shows that are like maybe a little more focused. And then it's like, hey, we're going to really deliver something like one idea or something in like 10 minutes. And, I think there are like Planet Money is another good NPR show that's spent a lot of time like kind of honing, like they used to do all their shows were like 20 minutes long, I think. And like, that's a good way too to be, again, drawing people in with this idea like, maybe you don't have 2 hours, but you probably got 20 minutes and you could listen about like one interesting idea or thought or something like that.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea. That's what I do with mine. So I will record like a full-length episode with someone, and then I'll just like take clips that I think are like the most valuable, and there'll just be like 2 to like 5 minutes, and then just post those individually. So it's like you can kind of go back through and just get the highlights, I guess.
Right. That's clever.
Yeah, but it's definitely different. I'm not sure if the whole short form thing, how long that will last and how will affect everything. I feel like podcasting is something that's like gonna stay around just because if it's more intimate, and it's like listening to someone in your ear for like an hour plus it's a much different experience.
Yeah, and it's immersive too in that sense. It's something you can do while you're doing something else, right? Like I think short form works very well often in video. You look at YouTube and you can go find a 5-minute video on practically anything, and like, but it requires all your attention, right? You can't really do that and do something else. Whereas as somebody who listens to podcasts, like I think podcasts are great when I'm like on a walk or doing the dishes or mowing the lawn or something. Like it's something I can do while I don't have to do something else, and it draws me in to like a different experience in a different world.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. I always listen to podcasts while I'm working out, which is so nice because it's like I can feel like double productive. Cram it all in at once.
That's right.
All right, so I want to switch to talking about your books a little bit. How did you start writing books?
Well, I mean, the short answer is I always wanted to, and so I'd always been writing something. Like even as a kid, I would try to write these stories, and I wrote a lot more short stories because when you're a kid, that's all you can kind of conceive of, like being a novel seems impossible to write. That's so long. And I tried during my teenage years a lot to like start writing books, and I would always end up crapping out around like 20,000 words or something, and just not really have planned out where I was going or what I was doing, and I get frustrated. So I didn't actually finish my first book until I was about 24, and I was working at a day job that I was getting bored with, and so like I had like spent a lot of my evenings and weekends and stuff working on this book, and then eventually I was like, I remember when I finished it because I was actually at work, and it was like a Friday afternoon. I didn't have anything else to do. I'm like, nobody else is watching or here, so I'm just gonna finish. I know how I'm gonna finish. Like I only got like 1,000 words left. So that was my first book, and I sent that off to an agent. I did my research and found like agents and stuff who might represent the kind of stuff I was writing, which at that point was science fiction, and sent it off and got a very impersonal but polite rejection notice, and was like, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess so, but I'll keep working at it. And so I kind of went back and forth for a while. I sort of, was sort of always plugging away on something. And then I ended up I was working at the time at doing like IT work and web development, and I hated those jobs, so I left them. And when I started switching to writing as like a career, I was doing tech writing, and I was writing, about technology, consumer technology and stuff. That sort of absorbed a lot of my day work and a lot of my writing energy. And so it took me a few years of being able to like peel off enough time to work on something that was purely creative rather than stuff for my day job. Because like sometimes you would write for like all day and you'd be like, oh, the last thing I want to do when I get home at night is like go back and start writing on something else. It's just very exhausting. But when I was probably in my like late 20s, I was like, I want to take another crack at like writing. I had this other idea that I had been working on since like college, basically. I was like, oh, I've got this sort of world I want to explore. And so I started working on that. And it took me like, I don't know, 3 or 4 years to like sort of finish the the draft of that first book. And then I found an agent that I met through a conference. And it actually turned out to be one of the agents I had sent my first book to that had rejected it. And so it was kind of a nice moment to like come back, and he actually was like, oh yeah, this is pretty good. We can work on this. And it's like, it's not quite ready yet, but like he was willing to spend the time and invest the time with me on going back and forth and helping me improve that book to the point where it could be then sent out to publishers. So, you know, this book that I finished again in like 2009, we did not sell until I want to say 2015 or so. So like it took a long time. It was a big investment. And, you know, it was very a long, arduous process, but managed to find a publisher for that one. And then sort of since then, I've been putting out a book every year or two. And I hope I'll be able to continue doing that, but it's certainly a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. So as you're writing, like in the earliest stages of writing books, did you find it like discouraging that you didn't you weren't immediately able to sell them, or like how did that I guess affect your writing?
For sure. I mean, it is. I was actually just having a conversation with a friend about this. I mean, I think the only thing you can control in writing is persistence. If you want to make a sort of a go of the career, you know, it is tough. There is not a lot of opportunity, and you know, especially if you are I think a lot of the people of color or a woman or something like that, there are a lot of the deck is sort of stacked against you. But I think the one thing that you can control is just whether or not you stick with it. And it doesn't guarantee success. Like you could stick with it and you could, you know, bang out books left and right and spend years working on it. And it doesn't guarantee you'll get a publishing deal, and it doesn't guarantee that you'll sell well if you do get a publishing deal. But you know, like the old sports adage is, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So you gotta sort of put the time in if you're gonna get anywhere. But it's certainly discouraging to feel like I invested all my time and energy in producing this thing, and it just didn't go anywhere. These days, there's a lot more opportunity, though, I think, which is nice in terms of the self-publishing world and putting out your own stuff. Like just as we've seen with podcasts, which is like predominantly sort of a self-published industry where people produce their own content and put it out there. You can do that with the written word as well these days, and people have made very successful livings, or just, you know, even like a good following off of producing their own stuff, which was a lot harder, you know, 30 years ago. You couldn't do that. You couldn't. The idea of these sort of stuff that you self-publish had a lot more of a stigma attached to it than it does now. So it is discouraging. But like again, if you are somebody who believes in what you're doing and you're very passionate about it, I think you can find an audience these days, and that's it goes a long way to making you feel like the time that you've invested in this is going to pay off in one way or another.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Just keeping with it. Now, when you were starting, did you have any like really strong inspirations for your writing, or how did you like kind of, I guess, come up with those ideas?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like any writer, I read a lot. I grew up in a household, both my parents were librarians, so like books was part of my DNA. And I think I absorbed a lot of that as I was growing up and reading like incessantly and reading widely all these different genres and types of books, nonfiction, fiction. It appealed to me, the idea of sort of creating a world. And so I was drawn to a lot of science fiction and fantasy stories where there are just these really interesting worlds that get created and people have really given a lot of thought to. So my favorite author of all time is a woman named Lois McMaster Bujold, who wrote this very expansive science fiction series called the Vorkosigan Saga, which is it's fabulous. It's all this sort of it bounces around in genres, which is what makes it so fun. Like a lot of them are sort of space adventures. Like the beginning starts with a character accidentally starting a mercenary fleet and then sort of getting into trouble. And it's just, they're funny and they're very lighthearted, but they have these wonderful characters and this fabulous world built around it. And then later installments, there's some that are more like murder mysteries, or there's some that are more like almost like straight up comedies. And I love the way that she can move back and forth fluidly through these genres while still maintaining this whole series that is consistently a story about these characters and these characters who age and mature throughout the series. So that was a huge inspiration for me. And I knew I wanted to write something that was like that, with like a world with these characters really just sort of grow and evolve. And then I also like sort of harken back to some of the stuff I loved reading when I was younger. I grew up in an age between the original Star Wars movies coming out and the prequels coming out, and I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Always been a big Star Wars fan. And when I was in 14 or something, they put out like this new trilogy of Star Wars books by this Timothy Zahn called the Thrawn trilogy, and I devoured these things because I was like super into that. I was like, oh my god, there's new Star Wars. There's never been new Star Wars in my lifetime. And I have such a deep fondness for those books that like they really just inspired a lot of sort of where I like the general tone of the stories I want to write. Again, these fun adventure stories where they're a little bit more lighthearted than there's, fun action and all of that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So like if you're drawing inspiration, how did you like make sure that you're not like taking too much, Like how did you balance that?
It's always a trick. I mean, I think for me, a lot of what inspires me is not direct, like, oh, I love this character or I love this world. Like, even though I started out with that, like when I was in high school, a friend and I started an online magazine, and this was in, again, mid 90s, so like early days of like the web. And we started an online magazine because we both loved writing science fiction and fantasy. And like the first thing I had published was basically a story like in the Star Wars universe that I had written, like, essentially what you would call fanfic nowadays that was not even really a thing at that point. And I think all writers kind of start there, like, because you see these things you love and you're like, oh, I want to play with those toys, right? I want to get those action figures and like get to bang them against each other. And I think, that's part of the experience of becoming a writer is like experimenting with that and sort of starting out by like, all right, there's an established universe or established idea. I want to sort of play around with that. And then as you evolve, you're like, but I want to tell different stories. I want to tell stuff that's more interesting to me. And I think what helped me a lot when it came to coming up with my own ideas is I was always fascinated by these ideas of like mashing different genres together. So like my series, The Galactic Cold War, is literally like a science fiction stuff mashed up with like spy thrillers. And so it's like, to me, I wrote that because it's like I didn't see anything that directly did that. It's like, oh, I love these two genres, and I would think they really would work well together, but I haven't seen anybody write books with that particular combination. And so I want to write that story because I'm so excited. It was the story I want to read. And so I took inspiration in a lot of the tone of other stuff, right? Like how it was written, or kind of just the general atmosphere of it, but not about necessarily like, oh, I love this character, I'm going to pluck these characters or these plot devices from these different stories, but just like I want a story that conveys the same way I felt when I read those books.
That's really cool. That's a good way to think about it, and that makes sure that you're not like taking too much.
Yeah,
but you're still getting it. That's really awesome. Your books look so cool, by the way. I've
Thank you.
never read them, but I was looking on your website. I was like, dang, I need to read these.
Yeah.
No, right up my alley.
A great cover helps, and again, that's my biggest advice to writers, other than sort of persisting, is like, write the book you want to read. If you're excited about something, you're like, oh man, no one's ever written this book before that mixes all these elements that I love from these different things. Yeah, you should be the one to write it.
Yeah. The whole like space sci-fi stuff is so fascinating to me. I don't know why. It's so interesting. It's probably Star Wars, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, all that stuff captures your imagination, right? I mean, again, like, I don't know. It's fun to think about what might be or like what's out there. I think that's just a very natural human tendency, and it's a reason why. Even though like I felt like it was always funny growing up, it felt like science fiction and that kind of stuff was made fun of or like a lot of time looked down upon. But at the same time, all the popular movies that would come out would be science fiction or like have science fictional elements, like Star Wars and Star Trek and Harry Potter and Jurassic Park. Like all of these things are science fiction really at the core. So like clearly people respond to that.
Yeah, definitely. Science fiction is such like I don't know. It's very universal in that people like it. And it's like Marvel too is all like that kind of stuff. It's really cool.
Absolutely.
So going back, you mentioned that you were a writer for Macworld. How did you end up in that position?
It was so I mentioned before I worked in technology. Coming out of college, I had an English degree, and so I always kind of wanted to write, but I also knew it was a difficult career to get into. And so I sort of went back to a job I'd had working in IT and sort of, fixing computers, that kind of stuff, because I'd always sort of been a hobby of mine, and I was pretty good at that. And after a few years doing that, I was like, man, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. And so I remember being at my job and sort of thinking like, all right, I'm going to make a list of like all the things that I would like to do. And some of them were like totally outlandish. Like I have no idea how to do this, but like one of them was like, be a writer for the Daily Show. And I was like, that sounds super cool. I don't know how you would do that, but I'm going to put it down the list. And I kind of came up with a few things, and one of them was like, a lot of them seem to be like movie and TV related. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll apply to film school and try that and see like if that's something. And I ended up not getting into any of my film schools. But one of the other things I put on there was like, I had been reading Macworld magazine since I was a teenager, and I loved just, I'd get my issue in the mail and I'd read it cover to cover. And I always enjoyed, especially the back page columns, like on the last page of the magazine, there would always be these just very sort of thoughtful, like what if sort of hypothetical columns, like, oh, let's investigate this one idea. And sometimes they would even be like humorous or whatever. I was like, that's cool. I would love to write one of those someday. And so I emailed, I noticed the editor-in-chief in the magazine at the bottom. He'd say like, oh, drop me an email if you have any questions. I was like, oh, well, I'll send him an email. And I asked like, hey, how do you get started in this business? Like, what would you recommend to somebody who's interested? And he wrote me back very nicely. He didn't have to, and he took the time. I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, here's a couple places that you might try to like pitch stories to, essentially, if you have ideas. I was like, this is super cool. Thanks. Like, and I proceeded not to do any of that because I was still kind of lazy. And then I decided to like leave my IT job, not really knowing what I was going to do next. And I traveled for a little bit and was like, I'm just going to sort of figure out what I want to do. And one of the things I did was at that point, there was still this annual conference, the Macworld Expo, where you would go and Apple would have these announcements and there would be all these booths and like sort of like a Comic-Con sort of thing, but for Apple nerds. And I was like, I always wanted to go. It's in San Francisco. I live in Boston. It's like all the way across. But, hey, I'm traveling around. I'm sort of figuring stuff out. I'll go out there and check it out. And while I was there, I happened to see a panel recording about some Apple topics. And one of the people on it was this guy, Jason Snell, who was the editor of Macworld that I had sent the email to. And I was like, oh, well, I should say hi. And so I went up to him. I was like, oh, I emailed you like a year ago about like getting started in this whole business. And thanks for your response and all that. And by the way, do you have any jobs? And he's like, well, no, we're not really hiring right now, but we are starting up this blog and we might be looking for some freelancers. So, shoot me an email and, maybe we can figure something out. And so I ended up doing that and I submitted some writing samples and they hired me to start blogging for them. And I'll tell you, in those days, again, this is 2006, I was getting paid, I think when I signed the contract, it was like $5 for a blog post. And I was very lucky when I finished my first sort of pay period, first month or whatever. They're like, you know what? You've been doing a great job. We'll give you $7 a blog post. I was like, woo, $7. So I just sort of like, I'd always been a writer. And so I just would churn through stuff basically as fast as I could do is like produce content. And what ended up happening was I did so much work for them that they started asking me to do some stuff for the magazine. Like, oh, do you want to like write this piece that will actually go to the magazine? I was like, oh, absolutely. Yes, I do want to do this. And I basically said yes to everything. That was sort of my other key. It was like, you're going to offer me an opportunity, I'm going to do it. And so over the next year and a half, I ended up sort of working my way up and becoming the co-editor of the blog because some people left and like I ended up sort of taking over their role. And then about a year and a half in, they're like, look, you've been writing so much stuff for us. It's actually just cheaper for us to hire you. So they hired me on as an associate editor. And I was there for a little over 7 years. And I sort of worked my way up from associate editor to senior editor. And yeah, that was basically a great experience for me. It was like my first sort of real career job. And again, I did end up writing a back page column from them for a few points. And to me, that was like, check that off the bucket list because that is something I wanted to do for like 15 years and I got to do it. So that was an awesome experience and I really loved my time there.
That's awesome. That's such a cool story how you got into it.
Take a shot is my lesson from that one. You never know.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Are you still writing for them?
Yeah, I do a weekly column for them or like 3 times monthly column for them that I've been doing for the last several years, which is just sort of an it's kind of the columns I loved reading, which is like, let me just think about this idea and like write like 800 words on this and sort of like, oh, I'm kind of curious about this and sort of tease out ideas for them. So it's great. It's a great gig to have. I love being able to write columns for them. And it's still one of my favorite places to read.
That's awesome. That's so cool. So you said you applied to film school. Before that, did you go to college?
I did, yes. I went to Cornell University. I got a degree in English, but I ended up not going to any postgraduate stuff because the film school thing didn't really work out, and I didn't really. I love English, but I never wanted to like go to get a master's or a PhD in it. To me, that always seemed just like too much like the academic side of it. So I kind of dove right into work after that. But yeah, I did spend 4 years at college.
That's cool. Cornell, I am actually thinking about applying there. I might transfer, but that's so cool.
It's a great school. I recommend it.
It really is. What did you do like right out of college?
Yeah, that was pretty much where I went and worked in like the tech support and web development. I taught myself to program. A friend and I, way back in the day, a few friends and I were working on a web comic actually, and one of my friends would do all the programming for it, and then he ended up like going off and getting a job or something, and he couldn't do it. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just teach myself to do this because no one else is going to do it. So I should like take it apart and figure out how it works. And so that ended up being something that, led me into this career that even though I didn't have a degree in like computer science or anything like that, I ended up working in this tech job at a university that was like, had this small research program. And they're like, we just need someone to support this office of like 12 people and build websites. And I was like, I can do that. And they're like, yeah. And you seem like you can actually talk to people like a normal person. So that's great. And I was like, yeah, I can do that.
That's so funny. That's so random that you just got into something that you taught yourself instead of using the Cornell English degree.
Well, it's hard to find a place to use an English degree. Like people always make fun of me, like, "Oh yeah, like you'll get used to serving fast food or whatever with your English degree." And I was like, I guess I really had no idea what I was going to do with it.
Yeah, honestly, any degree from Cornell, I feel like holds some merit in a lot of jobs.
I hope it helped, but not to say it doesn't come without its costs too.
Yeah, exactly. So you juggle a lot of things. It seems like your tech interests and your kind of pop culture interests all feed into podcasting, which is really awesome. I think podcasting is a really cool platform for that. But how do you juggle all of these different things? You have a lot of projects that you seem to be working on.
Yeah, it's tough. A lot of it is about managing time. One of the things I used to love doing, and I don't do really anymore, because of sort of post-pandemic, was like I used to go to the coffee shop in the morning. Like that was kind of my like work writing time. It was like I would get up in the morning, I would walk down the coffee shop, I'd spend a couple hours there. I'd sort of like be able to like disconnect a little bit from what was going on in the world and just sort of work on some writing. And that was a good way to break up the day because like I would physically move locations. Like if I then need to record a podcast, I would come back home and then I'd have that. And like, it was always nice because they use different parts of the brain. And so like, it let me sort of switch gears. Like, okay, I've been writing and very focused in on this idea for like a couple hours. Now I'm going to go into a medium where like I'm talking to people and I have to be social and like, you let me use a different part of my brain. And so I really always appreciated that. It's one of the things that makes it easy for me to juggle these different tasks is I never get too stuck in doing the same thing. Like I'm not sitting 9 to 5 doing like staring at the computer and only doing one thing. I'm kind of doing all these different projects, and it means like I can bounce around and be like, I'm not feeling working on this right now. I can move into this different project and work on that. And then another part of it is just like, honestly, like boring, like calendaring, like putting stuff in my calendar, making sure I carve out time to do all these specific things, and having schedules and stuff like that helps a lot in terms of like, not just being good about your time, but also like sort of scheduling your brain a little bit to think like, okay, I've got this thing I got to do later today, and I got to be sort of in this mode to do it. So I need to like, be able to prepare myself for that. It's a little more challenging right now. I have a 2-month-old, so that's throwing a wrench in a lot of like, okay, scheduling's kind of out the window these days, but you do what you can, and you just got to get it done.
Work around it.
Yeah, exactly.
So very like specifically here, what is your organization system? Like what calendar do you use? Do you use Notion at all?
I don't. I know of it, and I've tried it in the past. I bounce off a lot of systems, and honestly, I tried to go with the stuff that's super light on the overhead. Like, I don't want to spend too much time fiddling with systems. I don't even file. I don't file my email. Like, I'm really bad about. I don't even archive my email. But I use the basic. Like, I use reminders on my Mac and my iPhone, and notes on my Mac and my iPhone to just keep track of stuff, because it's super easy. It's always on any device that I have. So I always know if I write something in notes, I will have it. It will be on my Mac and my iPhone and my iPad and all of that. And I don't have to worry about oh, where did I put that one note that I wrote? And it's not, I'm not the best at structured organization. So I've looked at some tools like Notion and other things where give you a little bit more of a structure to work with. And I just always sort of bounce off them. I did play around a little bit with, Obsidian, which is this wild text editor thing that I would has this, it's almost like building a wiki, and I was some of it really appeals to me, but it also was super fiddly. I stick with a lot of the basics. I do use Fantastical, which is another iOS and Mac app for calendaring, because it's got a little more power. But honestly, a lot of what I do is just sort of with the tools that are sort of freely available, because and this is one of my other little mantras. I think tools can be a trap. A lot of times when people ask about processes and stuff, and they're oh, what tools do you use? What apps do you use? And it's okay, tools are great, but if you spend a lot of time worrying about tools or thinking about tools, you're not doing the work. And it's something that can be a very tempting distraction. And you think once I get all my tools set up, all the amazing creative stuff will just happen. It's nope, that's still very hard. So I think about this in particular. One of the tools I use for writing a lot is an app called Scrivener, which is this really great app it's designed for all sorts of writing stuff, but I know people use it to write comics. I know people use it to write novels. I use it for all my novel stuff. It's got a million different bells and whistles in it. And somebody was asking me about it recently, and I said, here's the thing you need to know about Scrivener. I'm convinced that nobody uses more than 10% of the features, and nobody uses the same 10% of the features. You can talk to 100 different writers and be oh, I use this and this. And people are oh, I've never even tried that feature. I didn't know that was a thing, because it's super complex. But ultimately, it's about finding the thing that works for you and that gets out of your way and lets you do the work that you want to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's so important to start what you're doing and then figure it out, as opposed to getting caught up in the details, like you were saying. I think a lot of people spend too much time figuring things out, and then they end up just getting burned out on that, and then just not starting the project.
Totally. And as important as finishing the project too. That's the other thing. That's the tough part, honestly. I've started a lot of projects I have not finished.
Yeah, no, that's super fair. With this podcast, I have an experience. I just started. I don't even know. I've used 2 different hosting platforms, and I've used a couple different recording platforms, different things for writing scripts. It's all gone out the window.
Yep.
What I started with is nowhere near what I use now, which is kind of funny. It's totally what you were saying.
Got to roll with the punches and figure out what works.
Exactly. When you start, you're not gonna know what you're doing. You're not gonna be good at it either, which is a very important thing to realize when you're starting.
Definitely true.
So you're podcasting. You said that you do some producing of it. What is what is your scope of that? How much of that are you producing?
Depends on the show. A lot of my shows, I do the editing, and that can range. There are some shows that are really just about hey, let's slap some intro and outro music on it, publish it, and that's get it out the door. Make sure everybody sounds good, within a reasonable length. But I'm not going through and doing fine edits. I'm not doing removing crosstalk. I'll remove if there's a problem, right? If there's a tech error or something like that, or somebody drops out, I'll definitely go in and splice everything together and try to make it sound really nice. But if it's not going in and removing ums, ahs, pauses, crosstalk, etc. It really depends on the audience for the show. There's other shows that I am super fine-tooth with, and I will take me a couple hours to edit, because I am going through and lining things up precisely and removing crosstalk and making sure everything flows really nicely and it feels a little bit more like a heavily produced piece. And so, for example, I do a show on the Incomparable Network called Inconceivable, which is a game show that I host. I have a scorekeeper, and then I have 2 panels of 3 people. So I have 8 tracks that I'm working with. It's a lot. That show takes me a few days to edit, usually when I put it out, and I only do it every few months or something like that. And that one I work very hard on because with so many people, it is tricky to sort of make sure you don't have too many people talking over each other and everybody's clear and at the same level. So I spend a lot of time on the production end of that one. A lot of what I do is editing and less in sort of the engineering part of it, just because that's not my background. I know enough to make people sound sort of like pretty good, but like it's, again, easy place to get into the weeds, and it's very technical. So I'm not as good with that end of it, but I know enough to at least make people sound pretty good. And then I'm also the person often on a lot of my podcasts that's sort of, lead host, helping people set up their mics, helping people like make sure everything's configured correctly. I have, a show Clockwise where we have 2 rotating guests every week. So a lot of that falls to me to not only do scheduling and like sort of find booking guests, but also make sure that those people are set up to record and know what they're doing so that we can like get a clean recording from them. Because a lot of times these are people who are not necessarily podcasting frequently, like. So on some shows I do quite a bit on the production end, and then there are some shows where, again, like I just get to sort of sit back and hang out, and those are definitely less work.
Yeah, definitely. You just mentioned that like the people that don't podcast as frequently, that's something I've noticed doing this show. Getting podcasters on the podcast is like such a life hack. It makes it so nice.
I will say my tip for that one is my friend Anthony Johnston, who is a podcaster, and I'm trying to find, he has a site where he like sends people. He made this like guide at one point that was basically, here's how to be a good podcast guest. And it used to be at podcastguestguide.com. It seems like that URL may or may not work right now, but it was great because it was like, here, let me just lay out like a super simple way to do podcasting, because he used to do shows where he would have a lot of guests on it. And he's like, yeah, I got tired of like dealing with that all the time. But I think it's out there. You can Google Podcast Guest Guide, and I think it's out there.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to find that. So you mentioned how some of your shows, you edit them more heavily, and some you leave a bit more raw and a bit like more just as it was recorded. Mm-hmm. Do you notice a difference in performance between those two?
In terms of like how many people listen or response or like the audience performance?
Yeah.
It depends, because I think the shows are kind of tuned to their audiences. I think, like, for example, a lot of the shows that I leave a little looser are shows where it's like, I do a show where we recap TV shows, it's like, so you're doing one a week and you're like covering shows. And a lot of times, a lot of the value in it is getting it out within a reasonable time frame, because people are like, oh, I just watched the show, now I want to listen to a podcast, like breaking it down. And so a lot of that is about sort of getting stuff out more quickly. And I think people are a lot more forgiving about that, because there is the understanding like, oh, well, this is a bunch of people sort of chatting off the cuff, and it's really just sort of about responding to something that they just happened. Like, it almost feels like a live broadcast almost in a certain sense. So I think people tend to be more forgiving about the audio quality, or about like the fine tuning of that kind of show, than about something that is, like I said, I do a game show. It feels like it's supposed to be a little more heavily produced and more targeted. But I find that the quality of the audio, like and editing and everything like that, does not matter as much as sort of the content or the genre, and like matching up with that. Like, I think a lot of times if people like your show, audio can sort of be a tipping point left or right. Like, I know people who listen to shows that they absolutely love where the audio is terrible. Like, some of my friends are big fans of this show called The Flophouse, which is a podcast about movies. And I think the early on, like the podcast was it was terrible audio quality because they didn't know what they were doing. But it was very funny, and people enjoyed the show so much they were willing to listen to it, even though they're like, oh man, the audio quality is terrible. But it's really good, and I love it. So, you can get by sometimes a little bit. You can coast a little bit if your show is really good and you got great content. You can get away with not having the best audio quality. And on the flip side of that, you can have great audio quality, but if your content sucks, nobody's going to care.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's the same thing that I've noticed. Not the same thing, but it's very similar to like video and audio. It's like when you have super bad video, the audio is good. It's like more acceptable than when the audio is bad, and then the video is good. It's the same thing as like the 100%. Content. Yeah. Yep. Which is really interesting. It's kind of funny how that works, but I mean, it makes total sense.
Yep. Yeah.
All right, so we're getting to the end of the episode. Trying to keep it not too long here. I have one more question that I like to ask everyone. What is one thing that everyone should buy that's under $50?
Oh, buy one thing that everyone should buy that's under $50. I'm looking around at my desk to see if I've got any good ideas on that.
Yeah.
I will say, under $50. That's tough. I think a good mic, if you can find it for a podcaster, a good mic, and there are some good mics that can be had for about $50. I'm trying to think if any of the ones I would recommend are, but I'm sort of come up with a blank on that one. But I think that's probably one thing I would recommend. It kind of depends on what you're doing and what your like sort of like interest is, but. Man, you totally stumped me with this one. I wish I had thought about it more. You can buy my books; they're less than $50, and everyone should buy them. I mean, yeah, that's one for podcasting. I would say a good pair of headphones for podcasting. And again, that's one place where I definitely think you do not need to spend a lot of money. Like people. I know people who are like, oh, you know, it's $250 pair of headphones. Like, you don't need $250 headphones. Your iPhone earphones will work fine, honestly. Any set of headphones using headphones, podcasting. Rule 1, you're already in better shape than most people.
It's so true. I used like the old like cable. It had like the aux port. I used those for so long, and they work perfectly.
Yeah, it's no problem.
Yeah, like it really doesn't matter. But yeah, I like that. Microphone and headphones. Those are both good ones. And your books. Don't forget that.
Don't forget those.
Very important. All right. So do you wanna plug your books or socials, podcasts, anything like that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So my Galactic Cold War series you can find at any bookstore that you shop at. They're on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, physical bookstores. I always recommend checking out local bookstores near you. Bookshop.org and indiebound.org are great resources for finding your local independent bookstores and basically buying books from them. Always support them. You can find all of the stuff I do at dmoren.com, DMOREN. That covers all my books. I have links to all my podcasts and where I write all my tech journalism as well. And you can find me on Twitter at dmoren.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on this episode.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks again to Dan for being on the episode. I thought it was a super valuable conversation. If you have any suggestions for future guests, remember you can leave them a review, hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or send me an email. Also, remember to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.